welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and this video is going to be a bit darker. I'm going to go down some dark roads tonight, and it's because I'm going to be touching upon some topics which will sound familiar if you've been watching social media on the recently released Epstein files. I'm going to be talking about human sacrifice. And I'm going to be talking about the dark cults and the dark gods which demand such sacrifice. Specifically, the cult of Baal. And I wanted to talk about this because there's been a lot of chatter about Baal since the release of the latest Epstein files because, well, frankly, there's a lot of material in there which sounds a lot like what these sacrificial cults were doing back in ancient times. But the name Baal has also specifically come up in one particular document which mentions the god Baal and seems to make a connection between Epstein and Baal. More on that in a moment, but it's brought attention to Baal. So I wanted to present some information in this video on the god Baal, where Baal comes from, what the cult of Baal practiced, but also just addressing some of the conflations and misconceptions about this topic, because it can get quite sensationalistic and people can be too quick to draw parallels between things or equate things. So I want to try and navigate some of that as well, while not denying the reality, the dark reality that we're faced with these kinds of topics. And particularly with the Epstein files that have been released recently, it's important, I think, for creators not to be sensationalist about it, because there has been a lot of sensationalism. People will take one bit of information and then exaggerate it and post on Instagram or wherever their sensationalized version of what's in the document, and it's actually not true. It's just to get clicks. And I've already been caught out once, and then looking carefully at the document and seeing actually it wasn't quite as dramatic as that. Still very bad though, and very grotesque. The point is we need to look carefully at things and not just believe the first alarmist second-hand information that we see on social media. So I'm going to have a more sensible approach to the topic tonight. So let's begin with the context in which this whole Baal question has come up again recently, by looking at the supposed document in the Epstein files that says that there is a bank account that was owned by Epstein which was called Baal. Did he have such an account? The short answer is no. If you look at the document itself, what it actually seems to be doing is describing a wire transfer that happened, and the bit before the name of the account says Baal.name, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. But the most likely explanation that I have seen for this is that there was some other document or raw bit of data that got fed into a machine, some kind of text conversion software, and then there was something wrong with the word bank, which led the software to interpret that word instead as Baal. And so that's how it appears on the document. That's what the mainstream media has been reporting. For example, the very reliable Yahoo News, and of course the mainstream media is very reliable at the best of times and doesn't tell us lies about anything ever. But anyway, that's the story from that news outlet, and it kind of leaves it there. That's it. It's just a coincidence. End of story. There is no association between Baal and Epstein. But I just can't shake the feeling that this is more than just a coincidence, given that what we've learnt about what Epstein and his associates were doing with other human beings, particularly with children, and how ritualistic it was, and how closely some of that tracks with what the ancient cult of Baal was doing. It's very interesting that the word Baal just shows up in one of these documents. And as somebody who believes in the supernatural and believes in spirits and their influence over our world, I can't help but wonder if there is something behind the word Baal appearing in this document. The thing that immediately springs to mind for me is an EVP recorder, which is a device used by ghost hunters. EVP standing for electronic voice phenomenon. And one of the techniques that ghost hunters often use for detecting EVPs, which are meant to be like interferences, like very faint electronic voices that appear in the background of audio or video recordings, which is like the voice of a spirit. One way that ghost hunters do this is by using a radio sweep technique. So they'll get a radio and then it'll just randomly sweep through channels. And as it does this, it picks up, seemingly random words on different channels. And then sometimes the words will form a sentence. If you ask a ghost or a spirit a question in a haunted house, you might just get a sentence back, cobbled together from these random words from the radio sweep. And so the point is, a spiritual entity can influence seemingly randomly generated words, or even letters you might say, in an electronic device in order to send a message. And so maybe something similar has happened here. Maybe the spirit that is overseeing the whole operation that Jeffrey was running with the elites is somehow coming through in the conversion of this word in the document, which is even more creepy than the alternative that it was put there on purpose. But I don't think that this is just a coincidence. That seems like the least plausible explanation to me, knowing all the things that I know about our world. But even if the appearance of the word Baal in this document is nothing more than an incredible coincidence, I think that there is already evidence that certain members of the elite are familiar with the god Baal and even revere the god Baal in some way. For example, in the infamous Yale secret society known as the Skull and Bones, one of the members of that society, who was Henry Luce, who was kind of like an early media mogul, attended Yale as a student, where he had the code name of Baal. Other members of the Skull and Bones had other code names. For example, George Herbert Walker Bush had the code name Magog, another figure of evil in the Bible. Starting to notice a pattern here, right? So the elites already have a connection to the god Baal, regardless of what the reality of this latest file might be. He's one of the entities that the elites pay homage to in the dark rituals that they perform behind closed doors. But who is he? Who is the god Baal? That's what I'd like to explore now. So Baal is a pagan god who can be traced back to ancient times, to the Near East to be specific. And his origins seem fairly innocuous actually. He was a deity worshipped by people around the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia even, but certainly Canaan. And he was a storm god. He also appears to have been a fertility god. And from the Canaanites, his worship spread to other peoples such as the Phoenicians and the Israelites. And thanks to the research of people such as Karen Armstrong, we know that the early Israelites were probably polytheists rather than monotheists. And the cult of Yahweh was one among many such gods and their cults. And the cult of Yahweh gained ascendance quite late in ancient Israel's history, during the reign of King Josiah most notably, where Yahweh was deemed the supreme god of all Israel. But before that, Israelites worshipped a number of other gods, which they'd adopted from the earlier Canaanite culture, among others. And this included Baal and his consort of Asherah, who also appears as Ishtar in Babylon, is also known as Astaroth. But then Baal is also actually mentioned in the Bible. And when Baal is mentioned in the Bible, he's painted in a very negative light. One notable Bible passage is Jeremiah chapter 19, verses 5 to 6, in which God, speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, rebukes certain Israelites for worshipping Baal and sacrificing their children to him as a burnt offering. Elsewhere in the Bible, this same practice of passing one's children through the fire, as it is sometimes called, is associated with the god Moloch, another god whose name comes up a fair bit when we're discussing the rituals of the elites. But arguably the most noteworthy story about the god Baal in the Bible comes to us in the first book of Kings, and it describes the story of the prophet Elijah and the conflict that he entered into with the idolatrous Israelite king Ahab and his queen Jezebel. So Ahab was a king of Israel, and he married a princess from Phoenicia named Jezebel, who then became queen. And the Phoenicians worshipped Baal, and so Jezebel brought with her to Israel the worship of Baal and began to seriously promote that. And this is something that Elijah was outraged by, and as a prophet of God, he saw God as the true God of Israel and wanted to put a stop to this Baal worship that had been promoted by Ahab and Jezebel. He wanted to put an end to it. And so there's one particular story in the Bible where Elijah decides to put the two gods to the test to see who's more powerful. An altar is built out in the open, and Elijah is there, and along come 450 priests of Baal. And Elijah challenges the priests. He says, we will see whose God is more powerful based on who can call down fire from heaven to light this altar. And so the first crack goes to the priests of Baal to see if they can call down fire from heaven. And they're chanting and praying from morning till evening. Nobody answers them. And Elijah actually mocks them while they're doing this. He makes a joke about how maybe Baal has gone to relieve himself, and that's why he can't hear their prayers, and so they need to be louder. So who says that a prophet of God can't have a sense of humor, huh? So anyway, that's actually in the Bible. I kid you not. Anyway, the priests of Baal fail to perform any miracle. Then Elijah comes along, and just to flex even more, he puts water around the altar, which will of course make fire difficult to catch. And then he calls upon the name of God, and then fire does come down from heaven and lights up the pyre. And then Elijah commands that the priests of Baal be seized, all 450 of them, none to be spared, and then once they are seized, they are slain. And you know, when I first heard this story of Elijah and the priests of Baal, I felt bad for the priests of Baal, but then when I learnt what they do in their sacrificial rites, I can't feel that bad for them anymore, really. So those are stories that appear in the Bible, but we might ask ourselves, is this all just ancient propaganda? Did the writers of the Old Testament make up nasty stories about other gods from other peoples as a kind of propaganda tool to push for the worship of their one God? This is an argument that has been put forward by certain modern historians. But in modern times, there have also been archaeological finds that support the biblical account of Baal worship, or at least seem to. So there was another civilization in ancient times, which came after ancient Israel, during the period of Elijah. It was known as the Punic civilization, otherwise known as the Carthaginians. This was a civilization which was established by settlers from Phoenicia, the very same Phoenicia that Queen Jezebel came from. And these settlers traveled to North Africa and they created a colony there, and then this became the civilization of Carthage. And then they eventually made their way into like Spain and stuff like that. So they were like an ancient empire, and at one point they were serious contenders for domination of the Mediterranean region. This led to the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, And this is where we get the famous story about the general Hannibal Barca crossing the Alps into Italy with his army, mounted on the back of elephants. Very famous story. Hannibal was possibly the greatest military genius in history, and he almost defeated Rome in the Punic Wars. However, in the end, Rome came out on top, won the day, and then they completely annihilated the city of Carthage. And of course, the rest is history, quite literally. Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean and defined the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. But that's a big digression. Now, what does this civilization of Carthage have to do with Baal? Well, the answer to that is that the Carthaginians worshipped a god called Baal Hamon. And this deity of Baal Hamon appears to be, or at least likely, based off of the Baal that was worshipped by the Phoenicians, which were the parent culture of the Carthaginians. And the very same Baal that's mentioned in the Bible, the very same Baal that was worshipped by the Phoenician queen Jezebel. And we have a bit of information on the cult of Baal Hamon. Ancient authors describe a Carthaginian practice of the people sacrificing their children to Baal Hamon. And then this ancient story was seemingly confirmed in the 1920s, by archaeological discoveries around a sacrificial site of urns containing the cremated remains of children. At least some of these were sacrificial, if not all of them. So the gruesome details were confirmed with evidence. So all of this means that Baal is a pagan god with a particularly sinister reputation because of the sacrifices that were made to him. So sinister, in fact, that Baal later came to be regarded as a demon in Jewish and Christian belief. It was quite literally demonized. So I want to turn to medieval demonology, first of all, European medieval demonology. We first see a mention of a demon called Baal in Colin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal. He then later appears in the Goetia, also under the name Baal. And this Baal was often considered by medieval demonologists to be one and the same with the pagan god Baal that is mentioned in the Bible. But this Christian demonization of earlier pagan gods and goddesses can be considered somewhat lazy, because it takes entities that were gods and then puts them on the same level as malevolent spirits that would be familiar from ancient Greek accounts or elsewhere. The kinds of spirits that you think of as roaming around graveyards at night waiting to pounce on somebody, unsuspecting person walking past. And all these beings just become demons, right? But that is a very unsophisticated way of classifying spirits. There is a more sophisticated view of Baal within the Judeo-Christian framework, which seems to be a bit more sensible. And that is the view within Judaism, that there's demons as like malevolent spirits that attack people in the traditionally understood sense, but then there's a specific class of demon, which is nothing more than a foreign god. And this is the category of demon known as the Shedim. And Baal is one of these Shedim, as is Moloch. So they're more than just mischievous spirits, and they're not pure evil. Like when we think of Christian demons, we're thinking of a purely evil, malevolent being. The Shedim have both good and evil qualities to them, much like human beings. Having said that, beings which have both good and evil traits can nonetheless be forces for evil in the world. Somebody can be an evil dictator who commits atrocities and also really love their dog. So there's good and bad within them, but they're still a force for evil because of what they do. And in the case of the Shedim, there's a clear association between these foreign gods and the practice of human sacrifice. Unequivocally, evil practice by today's moral standards. And we see reference to the Shedim in, for example, Psalm 106, verse 37, which reads, "They sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons." This word demons is translated from the word la shedim. This word la shedim is sometimes translated instead to false gods. They sacrificed their sons and daughters to false gods. So beings such as Baal can be considered both a god, one of the what would be considered a lesser god, and also a type of demon. So back in ancient times and back in some of the pagan cultures of the Near East and even the broader Mediterranean region, what would it mean if somebody honoured Baal? Well, it might not be anything controversial. It might even be the established religion of a particular society. But now in today's society, where we have a Judeo-Christian culture which wholeheartedly rejects human sacrifice and things of that nature, what would it mean to celebrate or worship a god like Baal? Well, it would be an intentional act of defiance against the biblical God, and it would be akin to worshipping a force of spiritual evil. And people often say that because how Satan is described in the Old Testament is not the same as how Satan is described in Christianity, that it's a being that is actually an angel serving God's ends. That means that there's no concept of spiritual evil in the Old Testament, but there absolutely is. It takes the form of the wicked followers of these Shedim and the kinds of abominable practices that they engaged in. So that's Baal, and that's the cult of Baal. Now, to address a few misapprehensions or conflations regarding Baal. Is the worship of Baal something Jewish? This is a claim that you often see. The short answer is no. It's not. There have been people who conflate Baal worship with the Jews or some conspiracy involving the Jews, which has its origin in the blood libel myth of medieval times, which was debunked centuries ago, but still keeps cropping up from time to time. And in fact, the worship of Baal is antithetical to Judaism as it exists today. So I mentioned the very earliest forms of Israelite religion were polytheistic and included the worship of Baal. But then we saw a development from around the beginning of the Second Temple period, maybe just a bit before that. We saw a transition to monotheism, and then Second Temple Judaism, and then the Second Temple was destroyed, and then we had Rabbinical Judaism. So from Second Temple Judaism, and maybe even a little bit earlier, the worship of Baal has been forbidden. Baal has been seen as a false god, has been seen as a demon, and to worship such a god would be considered evil. So there's just no way of squaring those two things. In fact, when you look at the commandments, the 10 commandments, number 2 on the list is not to engage in idolatry. So it's pretty important to Judaism, as it has existed for over 2,000 years, to not worship a being like Baal and not engage in the kinds of sacrificial practices that the priesthood of Baal engaged in. So that hopefully puts that question to bed. Although our knowledge of Baal originates from Judaism, Baal, remember, was a negative entity of that religion. So to say that Baal worship is a Jewish would be like saying that a Thelemite is Christian because they follow the beast 666. Obviously, Thelema and Christianity are widely different belief systems. What about other powerful secret societies or secretive groups that exist today? Are these linked to the worship of Baal? For example, the Invisible College that I mentioned a couple of videos ago. Are they linked to the cult of Baal? The answer again is no. Baal worship is a distinct phenomenon, a phenomenon distinct from other forms of secret society that exist, or secretive groups that exist. Having said that, the elites do seem to have a fascination with Baal at certain points, or deities that are like Baal. I think because of Baal's affinity with their own dark cult of human sacrifice that they practice behind the scenes, in which we are increasingly learning about. Is the worship of Baal the same as Satanism? That's the next proposition I'd like to explore. The answer here is not a simple yes or no. It's not black and white. So I want to go through some of the nuances. Even though they'll be lost on some people, I'm going to explain them anyway, for the sake of people that aren't just trolls. So the first thing you need to look at is historical context, and then the next thing you need to look at is how you define Satanism. So, as I've said previously in this video, in ancient cultures outside of Israel, there would have been nothing particularly dark or sinister about Baal worship, but in today's Western civilization it's different. If you worship Baal, or you admire the god Baal in today's society, particularly with the reputation that Baal has, that is a willful act of spiritual rebellion against the Judeo-Christian God, which seems pretty satanic. And that brings me on to my next point, which is, how do you define Satanism? Well, if you consider the broadest possible definition of Satanism, it is engaging in practices, often including ritualistic practices that are deliberately transgressive, specifically against the Christian God and Christian morality. So that would include the cult of Baal. And that's an important cornerstone of the philosophy of Satanism. And Satanism is specifically a reaction against Christianity and Christian morality, because Satan is the adversary and the antagonist in the Christian religion. Not so much the Jewish religion. The role of Hasatan is more complex in that religion, but certainly against Christianity, a reaction against that. But beyond the philosophical elements of Satanism, broadly defined, you can see people who see it as just a symbolic belief system, but there are some people who really do worship either the devil himself or demons. And the worship of Baal would certainly come under the definition of demonology, because according to the Jewish idea of the Shedim, and indeed how Baal appears in medieval European grimoires, Baal would indeed be considered a demon. I think it's virtually impossible to separate that connotation from Baal in this day and age. Even if the elites don't worship Baal specifically, or even Moloch, as is sometimes alleged the elites worship with very little basis, in my opinion, I think that the rituals that the elites do engage in, such as the cremation of care ceremony at Bohemian Grove, mock human sacrifice in front of a giant owl statue, are very reminiscent of the methods of worship that were paid towards the Shedim, are very much in the same spirit of that form of worship. Even if they are intended as purely symbolic reenactments, they are tapping into the same form of dark spirituality. And even if the people in those rituals don't take it seriously, they're just playing around, the dark forces that they're calling upon are very real. And any teenagers who have messed around with a Ouija board can attest to that. You don't have to believe something in order for it to enter into your life. But when we're talking about Satanism, it's a bit more complicated than that, because there is a whole subculture of people who identify as Satanists and practice that as a kind of alternative spirituality. People that you would bump into on the street. People that don't hang out at the Bohemian Grove or Epstein Island or anything like that. Should we lump them in with the elites and the kinds of dark rituals that the elites are engaged in and the sick sort of things that those people are doing? If you've watched this channel for long enough, hopefully you'll know that I'm going to say no. But I do think we need to be careful here, because there's a not insignificant number of people who identify as these kinds of Satanists, as more of just like an alternative spiritual practice. These people are decent people. They don't want to engage in human sacrifice. They don't want to do depraved things like that. For these people, Satanism means something different. It's a kind of romantic philosophy inspired by writers such as Byron and Milton. It's about a spiritual path based on non-conformity and independence. Mitch Horowitz is probably the most notable example of this kind of Satanism that I can think of. But for these Satanists, the being of Satan is merely an embodiment of these traits, of being a nonconformist, of being rebellious, of being independent, and being radically self-determined in the way you live your life. If Satan or his demons are believed in as literal beings at all, they are reimagined in these more amicable terms. Now, I myself personally would consider such views misguided, because I think that the ultimate form of conformity that we find ourselves under the power of is the conformity that we're pressured into by sin. And true freedom is freedom from sin. That's what I've come to learn in my own spiritual path. But to say you think that somebody's views are misguided is very different to saying that they're evil and they're doing reprehensible things in their personal life. And needless to say, what these modern Satanists are practicing is nothing like what the elites are doing. There is a common thread, it must be said, in terms of the shirking of the restrictions of traditional Christian morality, but these other people identifying as Satanists are more interested in straying outside conventional morality in terms of, what they consume, maybe the kind of music they listen to, and the things that they do in the bedroom with consenting adults. That's the key difference with the elites. So you can see very different aims from the two groups of people. Although, admittedly, once you get rid of that moral framework, things become very open, and there's nothing stopping you from doing any of that. But that is a philosophical discussion that is not the purpose of this video. I think it's unfortunate these modern-day Satanists have adopted the symbology of Satan to base their spiritual philosophy around. I think that it brings them under a level of scrutiny and disapproval that they don't deserve. But it's kind of unsurprising when you adopt such a charged symbol as Satan as the thing that you base your belief around. But I think in the occult world, in the occult scene of previous decades, there was a perception that the kind of Satanism that's presented in horror movies, these sinister cults that go after people and all of that sort of thing, were just something that was a fiction, a boogeyman, the byproduct of Christian fantasies and paranoia. Certainly not something that actually existed. So people saw no harm in labeling themselves as Satanists. It'd be like labeling yourself Darth Vader. Why would you be concerned calling yourself an evil figure that doesn't exist? However, now we're a bit wiser, and we know that such dark cults really do exist. Things that are worse than anything that we've seen in our most gut-wrenching horror movies. And these things exist in a serious way at the top levels of society, and it's not just a few kids, squatting in an abandoned building and, drinking beer and spraying pentagrams on the wall with spray paint and reading from the Necronomicon or the Satanic Bible. And so, needless to say, this creates a real predicament for people who describe themselves as Satanists today, but have no interest whatsoever in harming innocent people, as indeed most normal, healthy individuals don't. But I don't envy these Satanists. I really don't. Guys, maybe it's time for a rebrand. You can call yourselves Prometheans instead of Satanists. That's a little softer. That's got different connotations. I don't know. Just some food for thought. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is this cult of Baal, or this cult of the Shittim. You could argue that it's a form of Satanism if practiced today in today's society, or emulated in today's society. But those kinds of practices would have nothing to do with these more benign forms of Satanism. So, that's a lot of information. To summarize, there is something very real and very sinister going on with the elites. They are worshipping dark entities, or at least representing them as something that they admire. They are following a philosophy that can broadly be described as satanic. They are performing unspeakable ritualistic acts to give a sick kind of expression to their philosophy. Beyond that, it's hard to jump to conclusions about the specifics. Do they worship Baal? Do they worship Moloch? Do they worship the devil? Do they worship Cthulhu? Who knows? We just don't have enough information to say, but we can say, we can get an idea, we can get an outline of the sorts of beliefs that they have. But anyway, I hope this video has presented the topic in a sensible way, more sensible than some of the more sensationalistic videos and material that's out there. And I wanted to present some reliable information on the entity known as Baal. So I hope I have achieved all of that, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so you get notified of my future videos. If you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below, and you can also buy merch from my merch store. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.